I want to make a really important distinction as we go through this time period between Election Day of November 3rd and December 14th, when we are going to have the Electoral College meet, and if either candidate gets to the magic 270 electors, that will be the way we'll go forward. But what I want to talk about in the first 5 is the difference between vote fraud and election fraud. Vote fraud can take all sorts of forms. Dead voters voting. So obviously someone voting for a dead voter. Here in Texas, we just had our state attorney general announce charges against an employee of a senior center. These are people with dementia and memory issues, having registered and voted for 139 people in the home where she was working. That is vote fraud. There are countless, I am talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of vote fraud in this election cycle, and they matter and they should be prosecuted. But they are not really why there is this, they aren't alone the reason why there is so much attention being paid to this election and what the real outcome was. Because vote fraud, my terminology, vote fraud is voters do something that's bad. They send in their ballots and they're late, or they vote when they're not registered, something like that, or vote for dead people of other people. Election fraud, to borrow the left's term, is a systemic thing. Election fraud is when an entity actually systemically invades the election process and does things that have massive, large number of vote consequence. Millions and millions of votes consequence of this kind of fraud. This is what Sidney Powell's been talking about when she's been talking about this just astonishing thing that you heard about in our show, where we had Russell Ramson on the show last week, I think it was, and months ago and a year ago, explaining what his organization here based in Dallas, Texas, the Allied Security Operations Group, has uncovered, which is that not only does a capacity exist for a hacker, not even a high-grade expert hacker, but just a reasonably well-trained hacker, can get in to the electronically stored database of voters. So all these voters vote in early voting, and the vote sitting there recorded in some computer somewhere, and then between that sits there until election day. You have election day voting, and everybody finds out, how the early vote went and how the election day voting went. Well, if someone has been manipulating data stored in the voting machines, that is election fraud. That is the massive issue that Sidney Powell is arguing has occurred. And she has not backed off from this. She mentioned it. I actually talked with her about it several times in person. She has mentioned it, alluded to it on this show. She has spoken about it at great length on other shows. And she is now part of the Trump team that is trying to dig in and prove that this kind of fraud occurred in this election cycle. And there are growing indicia of the likelihood that this actually did occur. I will tell you also, she has a new website up called defendingtherepublic.com. Sidney Powell, defendingtherepublic.com. But it's important when your friends who say, well, election day happened and, fair and square, looks like, after all, the media called it for Biden, so I guess he won. If we're talking about the systemic level of election fraud that seems to have occurred, not just the voter fraud, isolated anecdotal incidents, but actual election fraud, we're talking about the corruption of the entire system our country relies on to move forward in the peaceful transition of power from one administration to the next, how our country moves forward, holding on to being a democratic republic. Sidney Powell would never say on national television that these things occurred or that she believes they occurred because she has heard spotty evidence. I've actually seen the presentation, the in-depth presentation created by this group, ASOG, that uncovered this. I know Sidney has seen it. I know many people have. I'll tell you one last thing in closing up the first 5 today. I know, not just speculating, I know that what ASOG uncovered, this Russ Ramsland and the ASOG group in Dallas uncovered, which was not just proof that somebody with a moderate level of skill could hack in and change election results, but actually his organization showed it did already occur. Happened in the 2018 elections. Their allegation is it actually flipped the result of the governor's race in the state of Kentucky. And I know that that information made its way to the White House before Election Day. I know it went to one of the very top officials in the White House. Therefore, I'm going to guess that the Trump team, you keep seeing all these very positive tweets out of President Trump, more proof coming, more information coming. I don't think he's just, blowing smoke in the wind. I don't think he's just trying to keep the troops cheered up. I think they are into exactly what Sidney Powell is talking about. I think that's the basis of some of the evidence that it is what they are creating as a basis of litigation in this country. And it is vitally important. If you are a left-wing Democrat who would never vote the Republican the rest of your life, or you're a right-wing Republican, or anybody, any place in between, if we don't have elections that actually can be relied upon, that you can trust the results actually reflect the decisions by legal voters, then you don't have, you might as well live in a banana republic. You might as well live in a country where people who can engage in this kind of conduct and they continue to engage in it and it's never uncovered and never exposed and no prosecutions happen, there will be no more voting in this country that matters. It is that important. Sidney Powell said last night, and I'm wrapping up my first 5 today, Sidney Powell said last night that this is the most important 2 months right now, the most important 2 months in the history of America. Because if we don't uncover the truth of what came out in this election cycle, and all, not just little voter fraud issues here and there, but the actual conduct of the election, the litigation pending in Pennsylvania and other places, which if you heard Hans von Spakovsky in the show a couple days ago was talking about what is the allegation in Pennsylvania. If we don't get this cleared up and we don't get to an honest result, we truly are letting down future generations of Americans, and we are actually letting down the whole experiment in human liberty that is America. And that, my very fine friends, is today's First 5.